is speaking with us tonight about believable acting for autonomous animated characters. We're San Francisco ACM SIGGRAPH, a chapter of National SIGGRAPH, and Cassidy Curtis is with Google Research. I've known Cassidy for quite a few years. I had the pleasure of working indirectly with him at PDI DreamWorks, and have known Cassidy to be this amazing combination of artistry and technology. Those two things put together just makes magic, as you'll see tonight. He supervised animation on characters in How to Train Your Dragon and Madagascar movies at PDI DreamWorks. And he fell in love with real-time graphics as a technical art lead at Google Spotlight Stories, where he worked on stylized rendering techniques for VR films such as Pearl. He's now the animation lead for synthetic characters team at Google Research. We're super thrilled to have Cassidy here tonight. And thank you so much, Cassidy. Please join me in welcoming Cassidy. Thank you, Cassidy.
Thanks, Henry, for that wonderful introduction. Let me present my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Yeah, so the synthetic characters team at Google Research, that's what this is all about. And thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm excited to see so many old friends and new faces together. So we'll get started. I had a slide in here that was, describing my background, but Henry's kind of already done a wonderful job of presenting that. So I'll just say, I'm an animator, you might say a recovering animator, but I'm also a graphics coder. And in particular, when I was working at Spotlight Stories, working on those real-time tools taught me a lot about the limitations of that medium. And these are two sides of my career that I never imagined, could overlap in any way, because animating characters and writing code are such completely different skill sets. So I didn't think that they could ever have anything to do with each other until I met this group of people, the synthetic characters team at Google Research. And they're this really interesting group of engineers and artists, and they've got a really diverse set of backgrounds in everything from robotics to AI to filmmaking to good old software engineering. And they had this provocative idea. They wanted to use modern AI techniques to create autonomous characters that feel as believable as the characters that we know and love from watching movies. And they needed an animator to help them out. And when they kind of described this project, I thought, that sounds crazy, probably impossible. And there's only one way to find out, and that's to join the team. I just could not say no. So basically, ever since then, my job has literally been writing code that animates a character. And so that's the project that I'm going to tell you about today. But before we get into the project itself, I want to lay a little bit of foundation about what we mean by believable characters. And I found a clip. It's an old one from 1979 that kind of does a perfect job of that. So let's play that.
Why, Kermit? Look at this tree. Yep. Isn't that terrific? Look at all those twigs and branches up there. Look at those leaves.
That's a great looking tree.
Yeah, look at that bark. Feel that. That's real bark. That's real tree.
Mm-hmm.
Great to be out here, huh?
Yep.
A bear in his natural habitat.
Yeah. Well, but Fuzzy, see, the thing of it is, though, you're not a real, you're not a real bear. I mean, you're not a real natural bear.
What?
Well, I mean, you're talking about a bear in his natural habitat.
Yeah.
The cows back there.
Yeah.
Now those cows, those are real cows. I mean, those are cows that are out here. They eat grass. They, they give milk. Those are cows.
Well, I don't give milk, but I'm a bear.
No. But a real bear is sort of a thing with. He's got sharp teeth and he.
Now wait a second.
Do you have sharp teeth?
I don't have teeth.
No. I mean, do you hibernate?
Well, only with friends.
No. See, you're not a real bear.
Now wait a minute. Now look. I feel in my very bones.
But you don't.
My
You don't.
very
Wait a
marrow.
minute. No, wait a minute.
That I am.
You
that I
don't
am
even.
now
You don't
here-
even have bones.
That I what?
You don't even have bones.
What do you mean I don't have?
I mean, a
bones?
real bear has bones. What do you have? You've got sort of a fake fur. You've got foam rubber.
What?
I mean,
What'd you say? I had what?
You got foam rubber and fake fur. You're an artificial bear.
You're telling me I have foam rubber?
Have you ever seen a bear with a magenta nose?
I got a newsflash for you, kid.
What?
Frog, you want to hurt? You hurt me? I'm gonna have to hurt you. You ready for this?
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
You got a wire on your arm.
What?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say it.
I got a
I
what?
didn't mean to hurt you.
A wire on my arm?
Yes, but it's only for movement.
It's only for movement.
Movement. It's not. I mean, I believe in you.
So that's Fozzie. Man, Jim Henson and Frank Oz, absolutely brilliant and so far ahead of their time thinking about this stuff. There you have it. Fozzie believes in Kermit, even though he knows he's a puppet. They've just had this whole conversation about how they're all just made out of foam rubber and fake fur. And throughout this entire exchange, we believe in both of them. How is this even possible? Well, it's a remarkable gift that we have as humans. It's called suspension of disbelief. You know they're puppets, you can see the wires, but you still can laugh and relate to their experience. And I want to point out that suspension of disbelief is not something that you do to someone. You can't suspend someone else's disbelief, only your own. It's voluntary. You come into an experience and say, tell me a story. I'll pretend it's real. And if it's any good, it draws you right in. But you can only sustain that state of suspended disbelief as long as the storytellers are holding up their end of the bargain. So to create a performance that sustains the viewer's suspension of disbelief means having control over every aspect of a character's behavior, everything from the physical to the psychological, in a way that reveals the character's inner life. And the craft of creating such a performance is what we call acting. So why pursue this challenge of acting for autonomous characters? Short answer is because it's hard. In movies, we can make characters believable by polishing every scene by hand until it's perfect. And we can approach it that way because we know exactly what's supposed to happen. It's in the script. But what if you can't know what happens next because anything could happen because it's interactive? Now, suddenly it's a much harder problem. So in this talk, I'm going to tackle this problem in two parts. First is a set of design principles that we think contribute to the believability of a character's acting performance. And then a demonstration, a simple autonomous character that implements most of those principles using machine learning and procedural animations. So theory and practice, and that each of those will be about half the talk. We're certainly not the first people to take a crack at this problem. Ken Perlin, notably, and his colleagues pioneered the use of procedural animation to express emotion and personality through movement. But to take these digital actors and get a believable performance out of them, you still needed to give them guidance from a human director, either through wiggling sliders around or keyboard input. So they weren't strictly autonomous, although that was the aspiration at the time. Meanwhile, there were people working on truly autonomous agents. Valentino Breitenberg showed that even simple deterministic vehicles can create the illusion of having emotions and desires. Joseph Bates proposed that believable autonomous characters could be achieved with a combination of AI and animation techniques, and that's something I'd say I agree with. And then Aaron Loyal fleshed out this idea by breaking down the concept of believability into more specific parts. And then Stuart Wilson proposed this idea of an animat, which is an agent whose behavior emerges from underlying motivations. So our thought process and the system that we built is in many ways a descendant of all of these ideas. And the back end of our system actually builds on a body of work that's already out there on emotion in motivation systems and in machine learning. But where our work differs from the previous work is that they were focused on using emotion to make the machine learning process itself work better, and we're focused on using it to get believable acting performance as a result. And game developers have been chipping away at believability for quite a while right now. And you can find the roots of a lot of our ideas in a lot of places. For example, this TED Talk that Henry did back in 2009 when he was at Electronic Arts. It's a great talk. I recommend checking it out. And if you look at this, this is a demonstration of the attention system that they built for the basketball players in this game. And if you look on the right and look at where all these players are looking, and even though the ball is not even on screen, you can pretty much tell where it is. So it's a wonderful example of like using the attention of the players and turning it into an essential part of the gameplay. And believable acting in games, I've said it's a really hard problem, and therefore it's really rare. But there have been some great examples out there. In the game Red Dead Redemption 2, the horses have this utility-based motivation system that drives their autonomous behaviors. And in The Last Guardian, there's this incredible giant chimera character, Trico, that using a combination of scripted behavior and procedural animation for locomotion and attention and physical simulation, creates this really amazing performance. And both of these characters are quite believable to the extent that players can actually form a real strong emotional bond with them over the course of the game. So hopefully this talk will give you some tools to help better understand why these characters work so well. So let's move on to part one of the talk, the theoretical part. What do we even mean by believability? This word gets used a lot by a lot of people, and it's used in a lot of different ways. It's very tempting to use lifelike as a synonym for believable, but they're very different concepts. An actor can be lifelike, but not at all believable if they make questionable acting choices. And on the other hand, R2-D2 is not lifelike. He's a droid made of metal, but nonetheless quite believable as a character. So what do we mean by believable? Here's how we define it. It's a viewer's assessment of a character's observed behavior as measured against the viewer's expectations of its capabilities. And every word in this we've thought about. The observed behavior part is actually really important because it turns out it doesn't matter the philosophical question of like, is the character thinking or not thinking? What really matters is what does its behavior tell you about what it's thinking? And the viewer's expectations also depend on a few other factors. The appearance of the character, its visual design, the viewer's prior beliefs about that type of character, and the viewer's understanding of the rules of that character's world. Let me give you a concrete example to kind of ground this. Here's how a character's appearance can affect the viewer's expectations. If you have a character that looks like this, you might expect it to do things like speak English, wear clothing, stage a takeover of a office tower in Los Angeles on Christmas Eve, but not if it looks like this. And it also affects our expectations of the rules of the character's world just from the design alone. If you were to take these two characters and drop them from a great height, you'd give them very different prospects for survival. So breaking a character's believability, even briefly, can undermine the viewer's experience. You may come into the experience willingly suspending your disbelief, but once you've been popped out of the story, it can be hard to reconnect. And believability is also highly context dependent. So an action that's believable once might not be believable if you repeat it or in a different context. So you have to think about maintaining believability across all the time scales from a fraction of a second out to the duration of your entire experience. And that is tricky because it turns out that viewers have all kinds of different expectations about characters. And that means that the illusion that we call believability can fail in many different ways. So what are all those ways exactly? Well, luckily for us, psychologists, animators, human-computer interaction, and robotics researchers have all spent time thinking about this. And so what we've done is we've pulled together ideas from all of these fields and compiled them into a list that we call the principles of believability. And these are all attributes of a character's observable behavior. So these aren't philosophical abstract concepts. These are things that you should hopefully be able to observe and maybe even measure. And the idea is that you can use these as design guidelines as you develop a character. So let's just dive right in, because there's a lot of them. Number one, coherence of identity. Characters should maintain consistent characteristics over time. Very common violations of this principle are when you let a different algorithm take over control of animating a character. So for example, when you change from a cutscene that was animated by hand to gameplay scenes that are animated, via AI, sometimes that can be a jarring transition. Or when your playful toy robot suddenly transforms into a corporate digital voice assistant. Physical movement. A character should obey the laws of physics of its world. And you see violations of this all the time, even in contemporary games, although it has gotten a lot better. Pops and hits and clicks, sudden changes in speed or direction, feet that slide around on the floor. But keep in mind that the rules of the character's world may not be the same as the rules of our world, and that's okay as long as you are following those rules. In Wile E. Coyote's world, the rules are different. Gravity depends on awareness, for example. Biological movement. A character should move as if supported by its own flesh and bone. Why is this important? Well, our brains are hardwired to perceive biological movement and interpret it. In fact, if you think about Disney's principles of animation, a lot of them, squash and stretch, overlapping action, arcs and spacing, slow in and out, all of those actually support the illusion of biological movement. Okay, principle 4. Self-propulsion. A character should seem to move on its own initiative. This one is kind of subtle, but psychologists have actually observed in studies with small children that inanimate objects that appear to move on their own as opposed to being pushed by some other force are more likely to be perceived as having agency. So this is something to look out for. Things that violate this principle are things like marionettes. If it's too obvious that someone else is pulling the strings, and I would say in games, when ragdoll physics takes over the animation of the character, that can be another moment of violating that principle. Okay, contingent interaction. A character needs to react in a reasonably swift way to the events that happen around it, in a way that demonstrates the cause and effect relationship that it has with its environment. A common violation of this in virtual agents and games is when you have a character's movement that's based on very long pre-baked animation clips. While one of those clips is playing, you could pick the character, throw a brick at its head, and it won't respond any differently. If that is the way that the experience is structured, then the character is violating contingent interaction at that moment. A friend actually brought up the game Dragon's Lair. If anybody played that old game, has similar issues. There's only these few moments of interaction. So something to watch out for. Here's an example from live action, this terrific satire called Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. And this is an amazing comedic actress pretending to be a terrible actor. In this case, she's violating the principle of contingent interaction by reacting to something that hasn't even happened yet. So that cause and effect relationship can go both ways, and it's important to keep it going, or you can have unintentionally hilarious results. Self-motivation. This is also a subtle one, but a character should appear to be acting on its own internal motivations and pursuing goals that satisfy its needs. Even simple shapes, it turns out, will be perceived as having animacy and agency if they appear to be pursuing their own goals. This is something that's been demonstrated even in 1-year-old infants. It's actually amazing. I kind of recreated an illustration for one of these psychology experiments. And the example on the left, infants were not surprised when the blue ball catches up to the red ball, but they were surprised when it passed it right by because it violated their expectations of this character as an agent. Here's another example from the same show of violating this principle. It seems like she's going someplace until suddenly it's not anymore. So it's important. All right, now we're getting to kind of the meaty stuff. The principle of attention. A character should appear to be able to sense and pay attention to relevant things in the world around it. A character's attention gives you a window into what it can perceive, what it may be thinking about, and what's important to it. But to satisfy this principle, there's actually 2 components to it. What a character pays attention to should be appropriate to its situation and also legible to the viewer. And this is most often shown by making a character look at something, but it can also be shown using any of the senses: listening, smelling, feeling. The principle of attention applies across all the senses. All right, number 8, emotion. The display of emotion tells the audience how the character feels about its situation. So if you want to reveal that in your life, it's pretty crucial. One thing to note is that almost every aspect of a character's behavior can convey information about its emotional state. So its choice of actions or inaction, modulations of those actions, like how quickly it moves, or more explicit display of emotional affect, things like posture, facial expression, tone of voice. But for an emotion to feel genuine, all of these aspects need to be consistent with each other. This principle's been talked about before, and it's often called emotional expressiveness, but I don't really like that term because it implies a false connection. A character doesn't really have to be very expressive to be believable. If you think of a character like Mr. Spock, his emotions are very restrained. He expresses very little emotion, but the emotion he does express is always completely appropriate to who he is as a character. Okay, and now we're starting to get to the ones that unify all together, the rest of the principles. Explainability. A character should behave in a way that lets the viewer form an explanation that's consistent with everything that you've seen so far. Explainability is about understanding why a character is doing what it's doing, and it really depends on everything that's come before. So if you look at these 3 scenes, they're all showing the same basic action. Blue comes in, blue moves toward red. But why is blue doing that? Is it because it's afraid of green, like as you see on the left? Is it because it's happy to see red, like you see in the middle? If you remove the signals of attention and emotion, you're depriving the viewer of the evidence that they need to explain what they're seeing, and the character's actions become unexplainable, like you see on the right here. So one other thing I wanted to say, which is that this principle of explainability, it's not strictly necessary that everything be explainable in the moment that it occurs, as long as at some point in the experience, you learn information that makes the experience explainable. So it's not something that's necessarily happening all the time. In fact, a little bit of mystery can deepen your engagement in the experience. Okay, number 10, principle of thought. A character should show evidence of purely mental processes, things like remembering, planning, considering, deciding. A machine might make a decision instantly, but these things take time. And so it's important to give those moments the time that they need to be plausible. And sometimes just a moment's hesitation is all it takes. And thinking can also affect a character's attention and emotions. A character that thinks can also attend to its own thoughts. In animation, we call that going internal. And they can also show changes of emotion that are contingent on those changing thoughts, and we call that inner dialogue. Number 11, principle of sociality. So we humans are social beings, right? We form mental models of each other that include things like the beliefs, desires, and intentions of other people. Daniel Dennett calls this the intentional stance. And these mental models affect what we think and how we feel and what we decide to do. So we naturally expect this same ability from beings that are like ourselves. Number 12, personality. What's written here is, I think, gets at it partially, but I don't think it's the whole story, that it demonstrates behavioral and expressive traits that make it unique. But personality isn't just about how a character expresses itself. It goes deeper than that, because a character's personality affects what they consider important, what they pay attention to. It can act as a filter on what they can perceive, and it colors their emotional responses. So if you just take these two super familiar characters and imagine offering both of them a birthday cake, or telling them both some bad news, you'd expect a completely different response from both of them. And that's because you understand that they have these different personalities. Last one, change with experience. So a character should behave in a way that shows the effect of its past experiences. It's the change in behavior that tells you that these experiences were meaningful to the character. And actually in robotics research, they've actually shown that this can affect the viewer's ability to empathize with a robot. So this actually manifests differently at different timescales. In a short-term context, you can actually learn a lot about a character's past from how it behaves now. But in a longer-term context, you might want to witness the experiences that caused that change. That's, in movies, that's what we call a character arc. So there it is. That's a whole list. I want to point out that this is not a recipe, okay? It's not like you take a tablespoon of each of these, throw it in a bowl, and you have a character. It's a set of guidelines for you to apply as you're developing your characters. And each of these principles only applies so far as the viewer's expectations require it. So if your character is something like, a photorealistic squirrel, you might not expect it to show much evidence of thought. And if it's a robot, maybe you don't expect biological movement, and that's okay. So the character that I'm about to show you, it demonstrates, I'd say, the first 9 of these principles. It demonstrates all of them to some extent, but it's really only the first 9 that we consider genuinely automatic and emergent from the system that we built. And why that is will become clear as we go. But before I go into the practical part, I want to just do one last little bit of theory, which is the design aspect of theory. I talked at the beginning about how a character's appearance affects the viewer's expectations, but there's also this kind of information theory aspect of character design. If you think of a character as a collection of details, every one of those details conveys some information as it moves around. And what the viewer is doing when they're watching your character is they're assembling all these fragments of information to form a coherent explanation for what they're seeing. In other words, a story. So here, Totoro's belly and whiskers are making this subtle movement. It tells you that he's sleeping and breathing. And Asia Kate Dillon, just using their ears and scalp, is telling you that there's this suppressed surprise reaction that they don't want to show on their face. Amazing scalp acting. That's one of my favorite things to see in actors. So it turns out that even if most of the information is missing, you can still piece together a really clear picture, because our brains have this pattern matching wetware that effortlessly fills in the blanks. We actually, not only are we incredibly good at this, we can't suppress it. But if any of the information conflicts with that story, then your brain starts to reject the illusion. This was a really interesting study where they took the same running movement, which was motion capture, I believe, and they applied it to different kinds of characters with different designs. And what they found was the more detailed and anthropomorphic and realistic the character, the less it was perceived as having biological movement, even though the movement was exactly the same in every case. And And nowhere is this more important than on the face, because the face is this locus of information. You know, as humans, most of us, neurotypical ones at least, spend a lot of time looking at each other's faces because there's just so much information to be learned there. So when you take a realistic face and combine that with mechanical movement, the results are instantly not believable. In this example here, this robot's eyes are locked in place with its head. And this is something that mammals cannot do unless they're dead or unconscious. And it also violates the principle of attention, because while he's turning his head, he's not looking at anything. Animating the eyes helps a little bit, but unfortunately, they're moving in kind of a non-biological way, so the results are still a little bit uncanny. So I want to say, you know, I'm not saying all this to like dig on this particular robot manufacturer. It's actually an incredible state-of-the-art expressive robot rig that they've built. It just wasn't animated well. And the main reason why I bring this up is to illustrate this key point, which is that your character's design should never promise something that its animation can't deliver. Put differently, every detail that you add to your character design is one more thing that you can get wrong. So don't add any details that you don't have complete control over. And in particular, that you can control in a way that supports the principles of believability. Okay, so that's it for the theory part. I'm going to take a drink of water. Now let's get down to some of the nuts and bolts. Let's talk about this character that we built to demonstrate these principles. So what we built is a system that animates an autonomous character using reinforcement learning and procedural animation. The core idea is that everything about this character's behavior should emerge from the same underlying set of motivations. And we've started with these basic physiological motivations like safety, nourishment, rest, because these are needs that all animals share. And so hopefully that makes the character relatable. And here's what the character looks like. His name is Asha. And we chose this design very deliberately because of how it sets the viewer's expectations. It's a quadruped, so that sets certain expectations for intelligence. It's an imaginary creature, and it's made of these disjoint parts. So the design is already being honest with you about the fact that it's an artificial character. But since our focus is on the animation, we removed any details that might distract the viewer from that, because we really wanted to see what can we say just purely through the way this character moves. So where does Asha live? It lives in this environment that has various elements in it that can impact its needs in various ways. So there are cliffs that are dangerous. If he falls from them, it can impact his safety. Food sources that give nourishment. Critters that can attack Asha. That's these little pink triangles down here. And they also compete with him for food. So let's take a look at how the character behaves. So Asha acts on its own motivational drives. It seeks out food, avoids danger. It pays attention to whatever is emotionally relevant to it at any moment. And it anticipates the future. And if something unexpected happens, it gets surprised. So all of this behavior that you're seeing here is driven spontaneously in real time by signals from the reinforcement learning brain. So how does that work? Let me give you an overview of the whole system. So reinforcement learning lets an agent learn to take actions that maximize the reward that it gets from its environment. And what we built is a system that extends this concept in a few ways. We have these multiple motivational drives: safety, nourishment, and rest. And each of these drives has its own separate reward function. And then we train a value function to predict future accumulation of reward for each of these motivational drives. And together, these let us generate emotion signals that represent how the character feels about its current state and its future prospects with respect to each of these motivational drives. It also lets us generate attention signals by identifying which object in its environment is the most emotionally relevant. And then the RL brain sends all of these signals to our procedural animation system, which expresses them as continuous, responsive biophysical movement in real time. And each of these components adds support for one or more of the believability principles. And then they all work together to support explainability. So let's now go down into a little bit more detail and look at these simple parts and see how they work together to create complex behavior. So things get really interesting when there's conflict between different motivations. Here, Asha feels positive nourishment anticipation because it's hungry and it sees this fruit. But when these dangerous critters approach, its attitude changes from hopeful to apprehensive because it anticipates a decrease in safety. And eventually the brain's action policy decides to give up and just look for food someplace else. Asha also has a simple model of the user, which depends on the user's behavior. So it starts out somewhat afraid of you, but if you treat it well by feeding it, its attitude towards you will change. And this lets us explore in a very rudimentary way the principles of sociality and change with experience. Okay, so that's our overview of the whole system. Now let's dive into how each component works. First of all, reinforcement learning. Why even use reinforcement learning? Well, we had a lot of options for what to work with, and we chose this because it supports self-motivation inherently because it's driven by these motivational drives, and also change with experience because the character's behavior is the result of the experiences it had during the RL training process. But also it lets us create a complex emergent behaviors from simple components, and it's agnostic to the design of the character and the environment, so it can easily adapt to changes in either. So the motivation system, it has these three simple floating point value drives: nourishment, safety, and rest. Each drive has a set point that it returns to. It has a decay rate that controls how quickly it gets there. And then discrete events that happen in the world affect the drive of values. So eating food pumps up the nourishment drive, being attacked by critters decreases safety, and so on. And then there's this piecewise linear function that maps each drive value to the reward incurred by the RL brain. So how does the RL brain perceive its environment? Well, the character's got two types of sensor that are meant to represent at a very abstract level what an animal could plausibly perceive. So, and these sensors are they're anchored to the base node of the character, so they aren't actually affected by the animation of the head or the body. There's a ray tracing object sensor that detects visible objects within the character's cone of view. If an object is occluded by rocks or hills, the sensor doesn't report it, but it does retain memory of the last known position of an object that's recently passed out of view. And then there's a navigation sensor, which detects the boundaries of the world's navigation mesh and reports whether it's possible to jump to another part of the mesh. And this is how the character is able to make some amount of sense of its physical environment. So that's the input side to the brain. What does the brain output? It produces as output an action vector of 6 real values. The first 2 are controlling continuous actions, moving forward and back and turning left and right. And these continuous actions can range from fast and intense to slow and subtle. The other 4 control discrete actions, so grabbing an object, dropping what you're holding, eating what you're holding if it's food, and the last one is roaring, which scares away approaching critters, but also makes you tired in the process. So the brain is making decisions and producing these actions at a rate of 5 times per second, which is frequent enough to let it respond swiftly to changes in the environment, supporting contingent interaction. Let's talk about the emotions. So to generate these emotions, the brain uses the current motivational drive values and the predictive model to produce 3 different types of emotion signals for each of the drives. There are the immediate signals that are reflecting the current reward, anticipatory signals that are based on the predicted future reward, and surprise, which is based on the derivative of the predicted reward. To generate attention signals, we use a kind of counterfactual observation. So what we do is we go through a list of all the currently visible objects in the observation vector, and we remove one at a time. And then we measure the difference in the predicted reward. And so the object that has the largest impact, positive or negative, on the predicted reward becomes the new target of attention. Okay, so the brain can generate all these signals, but we also need to express them in a way that supports the principles of believability, particularly the ones highlighted here. That is the job of the procedural animation system. And there are a lot of amazing procedural animation techniques out there that you could use for this, but whatever technique you use needs to meet these minimum requirements for believable acting. We chose to build this one the way that we did, largely because there was one person doing it, and we had we didn't have the resources of an enormous game company, so we needed to be pretty lean with our process. So our approach was to build up the overall movement from several independent layers that all run concurrently, and but each of them can respond immediately to changes from the brain signals. And this lets you produce a wide variety of behaviors from a really minimal amount of handcrafted input. Just to give you some numbers, less than 30 seconds of animated footage, handcrafted animation, most of it partial body animation, just the head or just the torso, is all that it took to generate all of the animation that you see in this video. So let's take a look at those layers. There's the gate system, which lets Asha smoothly shift between different quadruped gates as it changes speed. The gates are handcrafted by animators, but they're designed to caricature the movement patterns and weight shifts that are typical of each gate. And this is to support the principles of physical and biological movement and also self-propulsion. The attention system aims the character's head toward the object of its attention, and it triggers a blink animation when the attention shifts to a new object. And it's a subtle thing, but it's this salient change that draws the viewer's eye to the character, and it supports the principle of attention legibility. And then there's the emotion expression system, which transforms the brain's fluctuating emotion signals into salient changes in posture, gait, and facial expression, and that supports the principle of emotion legibility. And then finally, there's a layer of physical simulation, the floppy bits, that add overlapping action to Asha's headdress and tail. And this supports the principles of physical and biological movement, and indirectly also self-propulsion, it turns out, because in a weird way, psychologically, you perceive the character as being the cause of the movement if the tail and the headdress are the result. So how did we actually train a reinforcement learning brain to work with this system? We used the PPO method, proximal policy optimization, with about 800,000 episodes, each of them about 4 minutes long. So about 55,000 hours of simulated time goes into this character, which in real time is about 2 to 4 hours on the wall clock, because we're training on, massively parallel on a lot of machines. How long we train for is based on the accumulated reward per episode, which is what you see here in this graph. And we stop training at a point where that value starts to plateau. What's actually happening during the training process is Asha is going through this curriculum of training environments that we designed to give Asha enough variety of experience to develop all of the skills to satisfy its needs. We also model the user by giving Asha this scalar valued user score, which accumulates statistics of the user's actions. So helpful actions like feeding or petting increase the user score. Harmful actions like poking will decrease it. And then in the training curriculum, there are simulated users that span this full range of the possible user scores and the associated helpful or harmful behaviors. And that lets Asha learn different strategies for dealing with users and also develop different emotions toward them. So to verify that this whole process is working as expected, we run it through a series of tests. And some of these tests can run automatically based on basic pass-fail conditions, like does Asha escape from a canyon? Does it turn left and right to eat food? Does it avoid falling off a cliff? Other tests are more subjective. To test Asha's emotions, we created a series of scenarios that are designed to provoke interesting sequences of emotional reactions. And every time we train a new policy, we run it through these scenarios and we evaluate the believability visually. We call these tests emotional calisthenics. So as soon as we got Asha up and running, we started noticing that there were some interesting emergent behaviors. And these are things that we never explicitly programmed the character to do. They just happened as a result of its drives. When you first meet the character, it will visibly hesitate between its fear of you and its hunger for the fruit near the camera. This hesitation almost makes it seem like it's thinking. But later, when you've earned its trust by feeding it, it'll come right up to you and follow you as you move around. And we notice that if you hide from view, it'll step away and seem confused. And when you reveal yourself again, it gets happily surprised. So you can kind of play peekaboo with the character. But even when not much is happening at all, because the character's actions, attention, and emotions are all emerging from these same underlying motivations, the behavior stays grounded in its experience and coherent, which helps the whole thing feel genuine. So we were reasonably happy with these results, but we were also kind of curious, what's actually going on during this training process and how is the character's behavior changing? So if you look at this graph of accumulated reward per episode, we know if this value goes up, it's the character's improving at something, but what does that number really mean? To find out, we ran some tests by using snapshots from a single successful RL training run, and this is what we saw. So it turns out that Asha acquires different skills at different times. So by 3% of the way through, Asha's already learned to avoid getting harmed from critters, but it hasn't yet learned that it can get nourishment by seeking out food. And the thing to note here is it also has completely flat emotions with respect to the food, and that's because its emotions emerge from the same value predictions as the action policy. By 25%, it's learned to seek out food. It shows positive emotions about them. But if critters are present, it'll get very fearful and won't go for the food. By the end of the training, Asha's learned how to get nourishment while minimizing harm. And along with that new skill comes a bolder attitude toward the critters. I thought this was really interesting. We think it shows great potential because it shows how even a character's personality can be emergent from the RL training process. We also did a user study with about 50 participants to learn how people perceive our character. And, there aren't really standard psychological instruments yet for measuring a character's believability. So we relied on existing instruments like the Godspeed and Dimensions of Mind questionnaires, which, may be familiar to people who know robotics research. And users rated Asha pretty highly on liveliness and aliveness and animacy in general, and also rated Asha as being capable of emotions like fear, hunger, joy, and pain, which we would hope it could, because those are directly related to the motivational drives of nourishment and safety. But they didn't rate it highly on being able to experience embarrassment. And that also makes sense because embarrassment is an emotion related to social approval, and Asha doesn't have a motivational drive for social approval. So it's still really early times, but we found these preliminary results pretty encouraging. So that's what we've built so far. Hopefully, we've shown that if you set the right expectations and build a brain and an animation system that can live up to those expectations, you can create an autonomous character that can sustain the viewer's suspension of disbelief, at least for a while. So the question is, could you sustain that state for hours or days or years? Probably not. Is this the only way to do it? The way that we've done it? Is it the best way? Who knows? We're just getting started. Could we apply the same approach to any character at all? Yes and no. I would say yes, in the sense that all characters share certain basic needs, right? And the approach that we've used should generalize pretty well to other kinds of motivational drives. But no, in the sense that a more sophisticated character is going to need a lot more complex capabilities, like memory, for example, which is something that Asha doesn't have. So that gets to future work. What comes next? Well, let's talk about those last 4 principles. Hopefully you could see in the videos that Asha had these moments where he seems to be thinking, but it's just an illusion. There's no real thinking going on there. To really demonstrate the principle of thought, the character would need to have some kind of ability to plan for the future, or some kind of knowledge management infrastructure, the ability to be surprised by information that it hasn't learned yet. So that's future work. And Asha has a personality, mainly because we designed him to have a personality, and we kind of provided that. But those training videos show that at least some aspects of Asha's personality are actually emergent from the experience that it had during training. So you can imagine future characters where their personality could be tuned by weighting different motivations differently, or by giving them custom designed backstories. So that's another interesting avenue for future work. And we gave our character the user score, right, as a rudimentary way to show sociality and change with experience. But that was just, a game engine trick, right? That wasn't a true expression of those drives and those principles. So to demonstrate those more robustly is definitely future work. And lastly, we'd love to have better tools for measuring believability. So if there's any psychologists in the audience, call us. I want to leave you with one thought. Hopefully I've convinced you that believable acting is important, and giving you some tools that you can use to develop your own characters. But believability is not the whole game. Believability is just the table stakes, right? Suspension of disbelief opens the door, but you still have to give people a reason to come in and reasons to stay, an engrossing story, delightful gameplay, or something entirely new, some benefit that future interactive characters might provide. But that's a topic for a whole different talk. So that's it. On behalf of the whole team, thank you very much for listening. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, or unmute yourself and ask live. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidy. That's awesome. I'm going to just share a quick slide for those of you that joined late. If you can give me, yeah. And then there's a question in the text thread there.
Oh, I see. Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, I see a question from Mark Drummond. Is RL the only way you could create? Is RL the only way you could imagine creating the control policies for safety, nourishment, and rest? I think those could be easily hand coded. And then let's see. Maybe I'll ask these. I'll answer these questions separately. And Mark, feel free to come on camera if you want to make it interactive. Hello. Hi. So yes, is RL the only way we could create the control policies? Absolutely not. And I think the examples of the games that we've seen, they've done it in all kinds of different ways, using utility AI, for example. There are a lot of other ways that you could do it. What I think is different about the way that we're doing it is that when you use something like utility AI or one of these other kind of traditional game development techniques, there's a lot of handcrafting involved in making sure that all of these things are consistent with each other. And the more complex the game becomes, and the more the more stimuli are possible, the more work you have to do to accommodate that. So, so I think a reinforcement learning approach, that is a benefit of that approach, is that you can actually get you can get those things to happen emergently, and you basically design the policy from a very high level and let it figure out how to behave moment to moment. Okay, so your second question, how would you imagine laying a story on top of these basic reactive policies? We have an emergent reactive system, but there's no overall story trajectory being delivered. I think that's a really interesting idea. I would say we do the most like rudimentary version of that with the user score, right? Because we did hard code it so that at the beginning of the experience, the first time you connect this character, its assessment of you is somewhat negative, right? And then as a result of your actions, you can increase that score, and all of that is it's happening implicitly, but it was definitely with a storytelling purpose, right? Because we wanted to be able to tell that kind of Black Stallion, How to Train Your Dragon story of like befriending a wild animal, right? So I would say, take that super, super primitive idea and extend it, and that would be how I would build a story, on top of this framework. Great questions, super great questions. Yeah, any other questions?
I think I know the answer to this one, but I'll ask it anyway. I've always found with these kind of things, and by the way, great talk, really syncs up with some of the stuff we were trying to do in games and in that TED talk you mentioned. The eyes. I'm sure you didn't want to get into, having pupils and having eye directions so much, because it is so hard. And you mentioned that early, how quickly that can fall flat. But what was your thinking there? Is that something for future work?
Like why the character doesn't have pupils? I'll actually show you I'll show you a couple of slides. There was another, well, actually, it's better if I just show you this. I don't know if you can see this on the camera. Let me try to make myself visible here. Can you see this little guy? So this was actually kind of the original 3D model that Alonso designed and built with Day for this character, and we really did like deliberately simplify it and like get rid of the pupils and so on. And I have a slide here that I can show you, which is all about the. Here we go. Yeah, there we go. So. So this is one of the things that happens. If you're, so the short answer is you can absolutely build a system that controls the direction of the eyes and the direction of the head as two independent factors. I think you guys were doing that to a certain extent on that basketball game, right? But where it gets complicated is when the emotions come in, because the same shape of eyelids with a different head orientation will create the illusion of entirely different emotions. And unfortunately, that starts to take that out of your control. And there are ways to get around that. But now you start having to build a whole lot of complexity into, making sure that you're adjusting the eye line or adjusting the shape of the eyelids. We didn't want to open that huge can of worms for a project this simple with this size of a team. But that's absolutely something that I would do for a character that is, in a more full fleshed out environment. Yeah, great question.
I'll do one follow-up quick. It's very brief, but you didn't mention audio.
Yeah.
The little sound effects add a lot.
They do. Yeah. Is there a question in there, or is that?
Well, I'm just wondering, is that intended to be part of the system? Eventually, that's going to be procedural as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, now, I'm just completely theorizing, but I would love to, have procedural voice, for a character. And, I know there's a lot of amazing stuff happening in, machine learning models for voice synthesis and text to speech and things like that. And, though that's all for speaking characters, and Asha is just it's just a character that expresses its emotions. And the research on that is actually comparatively a lot further behind, because there just aren't that many people that are working on things like emotional prosody, but there are some of them, some researchers at Berkeley and some people inside of Google that are doing affective computing, trying to understand that space a little bit better. But it's also very much early times. But yeah, the answer is I would love to. Those voice samples were like just samples, and like in any game, you have some 5 or 6 different versions of a particular sound, and it just randomly picks one of them, just to try to make it not completely robotic. But if you sit with this character for an hour, you will eventually hear every single one of them. And I would love it if you could use a machine learning model to kind of interpolate between different emotions and blend between them. All of that seems within reach with the kind of techniques that are being developed these days. Wow. Okay, I'm seeing a whole bunch of other questions on here. So should I just let me just kind of go down in order. Hi Noel, long time no see. What would you expect competition from another autonomous Asha to provide for you? That's a wonderful question. So we talked about sociality, right? As something that we didn't really give this character, and I think that's how you give a character sociality, right? You have to give it other characters like itself, and you have to give it an environment in which it needs to form a mental model of what the other character is going to do. And there is actually a lot of research around this kind of stuff, but it all takes place in these kind of grid world environments where the agents are like, little, squares of different colors, and they're able to get better at solving problems by predicting, in kind of like a, prisoner's dilemma kind of way, predicting what the other agent is going to do or trying to understand what the other agent wants. So I would leverage that kind of work to try to, get in, get to some of that. Great question. Let's see. Okay, there's a question from David Weatherly about about what tools we used. So so we used Unity. We built the whole thing in Unity. A whole lot of C# scripting. The backend brain, I believe, is a combination of Python and some internal tools that we have access to for training these models and deploying them at runtime. But the model does run at runtime on your local device. We're not doing any kind of like a cloud thing in the examples you see here. So and then but no, we're not using Unity's ML agents. I think we had a different framework for that, which I want to say it was Seed RL. I don't know if any of the some of my co-authors might have joined the meeting. So if any of you guys are here and can speak more to the architecture, feel free to pipe in the chat or unmute yourselves. But yeah, that's as far as I know. I'm just kind of the animation side. Okay, so let's see. Mark Drummond, do you have opinions about the value of behavior trees as a way to combine primitive behaviors as compared to, say, state machines? I don't personally have an opinion about that because I've actually never worked in games as a game developer. So my exposure to the real-time tools was really through Spotlight Stories, which were largely kind of guided narrative experiences. So there might be kind of branching in some of the stories, but it was never to the extent of having behavior trees or state machines. Well, I mean, they were actually state machines, but not the kind of state machine that you think of for animating a character in a game. So I don't have an opinion about it, except that they're both a little daunting to the uninitiated. Okay, Dave's feedback. Hi, Dave. Is your team's goal to create characters for games, or are you also working on autonomous behavior for digital helpers, robotics, etc.? So our team's really a research team, right? So we're we're just trying to get at these fundamental questions, and hopefully the questions that we're digging into and the solutions that we're trying to develop have a lot of different applications. So that may seem like kind of a non-answer, but whether it's useful for characters in games or digital helpers or robotics, personally, I think it would be useful for all of those things, and I hope that it could be used for all of those things. Does that kind of answer your question, sort of? Yeah, awesome. Okay, and then also, it looked like you have a way for Asha to react to video input of people. Yes, that's true. Yeah, I didn't mention that in the talk, but we do describe it in the paper. So if you turn on your device camera when you're running the app, we use I believe it's called MoveML, which is like a tool that was developed at Google for doing face tracking and body tracking for AR type applications. So we use that, but only for the purpose of just telling the system where your nose is. So it doesn't absorb any information about like your identity or anything like that. It's just is there a face on screen, and if so, where is it? And that's what allows the character to kind of like track you as you move around. Awesome. Good to see you, man. Okay, how are you planning to expand the environment? Do the enemies have RL? Okay, so the critters, those little triangles, they do not have RL. They are programmed using good old-fashioned state machines, and a lot of like actually hand-coded state machines. That was like Peter and Alonso, built a lot of that, and that was actually a really interesting contrast. The kind of the ways that it was, in some ways painful to really try to tune the behavior of the critters to produce good results, piggybacked on top of the fact that those critters would then be part of the training process for our RL character. That was, quite a bit of a Rube Goldberg device that we had to wrestle with. But no, the enemies do not have RL. And the environment doesn't have RL either. It's all just like strictly, hand-coded game mechanics. I think we do have like, day and night, and the character can fall asleep and things like that. As far as what we plan to do to expand the environment, that really depends on the use case. The purpose of this was really to try to just demonstrate that we could build a character that, behaves autonomously in the first place. So, it just depends on the context. Is this going to be a character in a game, and does it need to impact the gameplay, or does the character exist for some other purpose? So I would let the product, decide how much we expand the environment and so forth. And Brian is asking, did you try putting 2 RL agents in there, 2 Ashas? Not yet, but I really hope that we can in the future. It would be so much fun. And Emra is asking, is Asha available to play with online, or is there a trained version? Not yet. It's currently it's something that we have to like manually cut a build and send it. So watch this space. Hopefully we'll find a way to like get Asha in the hands of users. Let me see. Okay, Noel, when you did the RL training, how did you decide what exercises to run it through its paces? Did you watch a lot of dog training videos? That question does get to some interesting stuff, because why did we have the particular exercises that we did? A lot of that was in response to weird behavior that we saw as we were developing the character. So early on, we worked on it for many months, and early on, sometimes the character would, you'd get a very good value back on your, reward. But when you look at the character, everything's fine, except when it's not doing anything else, it just spins around in place without stopping. And that may actually have been an optimal policy from the perspective of the particular weighting of drives and so forth. But it wasn't enjoyable to look at. So in situations like that, we would basically add features to the training curriculum to give it a reason to not do that. So that we try to be honest about that. So, in the landscape that Asha lives in, actually, let me see, in this landscape here, there are these cliffs and there's this waterfall right over here, right? And one thing that happened during training was Asha would get kind of stuck in the waterfall. We originally put the waterfall there because we had a whole storyline in mind where Asha was afraid of the water and didn't want to cross the river, and all that went out the window as the complexity we were trying to do became clear. But we still had this beautiful landscape, so we left it in. So Asha can just walk right through the river, but sometimes he would get stuck in that waterfall and just like spin around in place there. So that was why we created that like escapes from canyon piece of the training curriculum to make sure that it understood that there were situations where, like, if you're surrounded by walls on all sides and there's nothing for you to eat, you'd probably better find your way out. And that's why that became both part of the training curriculum and part of the tests. Well, similar but not exactly the same environments would be used in training and in the tests that we'd run afterwards. Kind of a long-winded answer, but hopefully that answers the question. Gosh, okay, so yeah, okay, yeah. Hi, Mark. I thought you looked and sounded familiar. All right, so did you write debug tools for the fail cases? Well, we did, like Unity has a test architecture. So for the tests that actually do have pass fail conditions, we were able to actually write those tests in a way that they just, if the tests fail, it brings up a red flag and you're like, okay, that's not a good policy. Let's go down to the next one on the list. Yeah, when we train the policies, we would usually train several of them at once because there's a lot of stochasticity and randomness in the way that this particular training approach works, and so very often, like, subtle changes in the initial conditions of the neural network will actually result in a different policy, and so I think we usually would train 5 models, and typically the one that we would end up using would be one of the top 3, but it wasn't always the model that looked best and had the nicest user experience. Wasn't always the one that had like the very best reward response. So that's actually a whole other area for research that we'd like to investigate more. I don't know if that answers your question about debug tools, but that's kind of how we approached it. Awesome. Well, I think so. That's all the questions I see in the chat. I don't know if anybody has questions live, but that's all I got. Yeah. What next? I mean, I'll say look at the future work slide for some of what's next from us. I'm hoping that other researchers and developers out there will kind of pick up on some of these ideas and maybe start filling in some of the gaps, because there's right now it's like we're so early in this process. There's more gaps than there are solutions. So it's a wide open field with lots of problems to solve. And yeah, huge shout out to all the PDIers. Great to see you all. Thanks, Engine. Henry, I don't know if was there any outro slides or material you wanted to show?
I just want to mention, if anybody's interested in National SIGGRAPH and you join late, early registration deadline is April 28th. It's in LA this year. It's the 50th anniversary. lots of more cool stuff like this at National SIGGRAPH. If you've never been to one, it's time to go. And our next event is going to be in May with Paul Debevec. But yes, thank you, Cassidy. Thank you, Teresa and Andy and everybody on our team that helps make these things happen. Really appreciate everybody's help. Such brilliant work. I just love meeting, getting to know people like you, Cassidy, that the art and science are just in one person. It's amazing. That's cool. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Henry. Well, it's really, I mean, I'm just representing it as really the whole team that is that hybrid of like art and science is really, you know, this whole team of people, because many of them individually are both artists and scientists. I'm just drawn to that kind of environment. I think all of us in computer graphics are, you know, to a large extent. So yeah. Awesome.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate people showing up, and some great questions as well. I think that's it for me, unless you had any last comments, Cassidy.
No, just thank you all for coming.
Thank you. We'll post a video, so I'll look for that.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.